So I'm going to be going over the Employment Ontario data that is shared by the ministry with the workforce planning boards. And we get client data on these different programs that are listed here: employment services, literacy and basic skills, second career, and so on. And it's now been around, I think this is the 6th year that we've gotten this data. And I was reflecting on this because I have to tell you, when we got the first batch 6 years ago, it was very hard to know even where to begin, how to look at it, because there was all kinds of client data about their demographic backgrounds, labor market outcomes, and education levels, and so on. And certainly in the first year or two, partly we were trying to figure out how to understand and present the data. And I remember in presentations that I'd be doing, like to audiences like you and to other workforce planning board areas, part of it was just kind of saying, okay, does this make sense to you? Does this accord with your experience? Are we understanding this data in the right way? And then by around the 3rd or 4th year, we'd had enough data that we had also something to compare it to, that we could see what the trends were. We weren't only comparing, say, the board results or the area of, say, Simcoe Muskoka to that of the central region to that of Ontario. So how do these different geographies, how do the clients differ in any respect, or how do outcomes differ, or so on. But then we can also look at time-based comparisons. What's been changing over the course of several years. And in addition to preparing slides, I'd be preparing a narrative report. So the report for this would come out to maybe around 35 pages. And I'm doing this for sometimes as many as 6 or 8 workforce planning boards. So I gotta tell you, I take shortcuts, okay? Like, it's not as if I write each report from fresh, right? I start with a template. And even the text, I am using the same text. This is a professional disclosure here, because this is not, we're not writing War and Peace here, right? This is not a Stephen King page turner. This is data. It's painful, frankly, to write this stuff. But it's interesting because what happens when you use a template like that, so like, as I'm doing these slides or I'm writing up the narrative report, I can see what I wrote last year, and then each year you're kind of making a little tweak, like, oh, it went up this year, this year it went down, whatever. And so over time you also start seeing certain patterns. And I think the thing that struck me the most, because again, going back to using last year's report, I'm also seeing in last year's report, I'm comparing last year to the year before. So the point I want to tell you is, for around 3 years, the data hasn't changed. I mean, it is really quite remarkable. And I think partly, and I'm trying to figure out why that might be, and I think partly is that the labor market in many ways has been humming at a certain kind of trajectory. The unemployment's been, the unemployment numbers have largely been going down slowly, and there haven't been the same kind of dislocations that we were feeling even 5 or 6 years ago. There were much bigger changes. You'd see changes, especially say among some of the age groups. We traditionally, youth do not take up Employment Ontario services in the same proportion as they are in the unemployed category, okay, for example. But sometimes we would see some changes in what proportion of youth were using the services, depending on how much the province was investing in youth programs that might attract more youth. But all that seems to have now passed, to tell you the truth. And I have a feeling that these numbers are only going to start changing again One, if there's some big change in terms of what kind of program is offered, but probably the bigger change will happen when we hit the next recession. And all of a sudden, the client profile is going to change. You know, that's kind of my lesson, I suppose, from the data. And so in some cases, I'm actually going to try and go through the data a bit faster, because, as I say, there's not as many lessons, I don't think, to be learned from the data. But still, there's some relevant comparisons to be made. That's number one. Secondly, most of what I'll be talking about are on those first, well, certainly employment services is going to take up a lot of the discussion. Partly has to do with how much data we get. We get far more data from the government, from the ministry on employment services than we do on some of the other programs. And when we get to apprenticeship, traditionally I haven't done that much on the apprenticeship numbers, again, because there usually aren't that many numbers. But this time I will take a pause and I will bring you up to date on the skilled trades work that has been going on. As you probably are aware, the province intends to put a lot more emphasis on the skilled trades and apprenticeship this year. And all the workforce planning boards and local employment planning councils were mandated this summer to undertake a study of what skilled trades are in demand in their local area and what employers are saying about the apprenticeship system. So I will, when we get to that part of the presentation, I will take a few minutes to tell you what we've learned from that, because I think it'll be of interest, and as service providers, you're going to be, I think, hearing more about the apprenticeship programs. Okay? And of course, at any time, please put up your hand if there's a question about a slide, and I'll try and answer it. So we'll start with employment services. And again, for those of you who haven't been part of this exciting presentation in the past, let me first of all tell you what the profile is like here in terms of how I present the data. So you see these columns: board, region, and Ontario. So I take the data, so this is 2018-2019 data. I will try and label which category we're talking about and which piece of information is being analyzed, but I always try and compare the board to the region to Ontario. And again, because these slides are used in so many other areas, I don't put on the name of the location. So the board is Simcoe-Muskoka area. Region is Central Region. So you know the ministry has divided these services into regional groups. So the region is Simcoe, Muskoka, York, Durham, Toronto, Peel, and Halton. Okay. And in most respects, I mean, the truth is Simcoe and Muskoka shouldn't be part of that region. Okay? Because those other areas are much more urban, apart from Durham, have typically higher levels of university attainment as opposed to college level attainment, have many more newcomers. So anytime you compare, most of the time I'll say, when we compare Simcoe and Muskoka to its region, Simcoe and Muskoka is kind of a bit off. Simcoe and Muskoka will actually be often closer to what the Ontario figures are like. And if we took out the GTA, if we took out Central Region from the Ontario figures, then Simcoe and Muskoka would almost be a perfect match with the rest of Ontario. So the GTA really distorts the figures in various ways. All right. So the first one here is just the unassisted clients, and we only have one set of data on the unassisted clients, which is basically the number. We don't have other data around age or gender. And to try and understand this figure, so we have like around 17,000 unassisted clients being served in the Simcoe-Muskoka area. I try and find okay, what's a yardstick that can give us some sense? Is this a large number? Is it a small number? So the only one I could think of in this case was just to look at what is the proportion of of Ontario's population that lives in Simcoe, Muskoka. And it turns out, okay, so in 2016, the census data, 4% of the Ontario population lives in Simcoe, Muskoka. It turns out, so the unassisted client number in Simcoe, Muskoka represents 3.3% of the Ontario unassisted number. So it's slightly lower, and it has been. I'm showing the previous year's percentages just to, again, show you some trends. So essentially, the unassisted proportion as a share of Ontario's proportion has been dropping. Just to kind of explain how this slide tries to understand the data, okay? All right. Okay, assisted clients, and now just about everything else on employment services is going to be everything is going to be on assisted clients under employment services. So here again, you can see, and again I've shown the client shares in previous years. So it's slightly lower, right? It's always around 3.1, 3.3%, which is lower than the provincial share. And the same thing applies to the region. So essentially the uptake of employment services assisted clients is higher outside the central region than it is locally. Not by by enough that it's statistically relevant. In terms of age groups, so there I've compared 3 years of age profiles. At the top is 2018, 2019, and the year before that. And then on the right column, I'm comparing it to the share, the proportions by age of all of the unemployed. So I think, and again, the best data we have for that, I've just used the census data, and I know that's 2016, but by and large, in terms of the proportions by age groups, especially since the labor market has been relatively stable, similarly, the age profiles have been stable of the unemployed. And I think the relevant thing here is to show that at the board level, around 22% of clients are 15 to 24 years old, but among all unemployed, that same age group actually makes up around 34%. So that's where the big difference is, and that's where the big difference has always been. That's where the significant gap is found. The only other thing I'd say is that the board tends to have a slightly older population profile in terms of its residents, in terms of its unemployed. You look at those numbers, the share of unemployed by age group. So the board has like 5% are over 65, 29% between 45 and 64. And certainly, significantly, Muskoka has an older age profile than Simcoe. Gender. So the gender numbers, essentially it's the unemployed, so there's slightly more males who, first of all, slightly more males who make up the labor force, slightly more males who make up the unemployed. And it's only in the GTA that in fact you see a larger proportion of clients who are females. So in the central region, you can see that figure 53.5% versus 46%. Females to males, and elsewhere it's kind of even. And actually that has changed, not so much from last year, but you go back a couple of years, and there's certainly in most of the rest of Ontario, the males make up the larger portion of the employment service clients, but that seems to have evened out. But still, and I guess if I had to explain why the GTA has a larger portion, my guess is it's actually more of the newcomer immigrant population uses employment services there, and more of the women will tend to use those services rather than the men. Then we have these designated groups that you would be familiar with in your reporting. And we have more than that in terms of which designated groups are reported upon, but I'm only showing these 4 because it's the only ones for which I can get some relevant comparison figures to provide a context. So for newcomers, for visible minorities, Aboriginal group, and persons with disability. Sorry, I should also say I do have it for internationally trained professionals, and that's going to be on the next slide. So there, again, I'm comparing the breakdown of your clients by designated group to what share of the unemployed these designated groups make up at the local level, the board level, or Ontario. Now, again, because we've done this for a number of years, there's a few things we know about this data. So let me deal with the easy stuff first. So by and large, newcomers do tend to use the employment services more so than their share of the unemployed. Okay? And that's across the board. Secondly, Aboriginal groups I'm going to mention next. Their share of employment services has been growing over the last 4 or 5 years. Each year it's gone up slightly, and it's getting close to now what their share of the unemployed is. So I think that's a good sign that the Aboriginal people are making more use of employment services. The persons with disability, we didn't report on that before because we didn't have a way to really make a comparison, but now StatsCan has produced a survey on persons with disabilities that has a figure for the unemployed. So in Ontario, and actually for Ontario, the disability figure I think is for 2017. So around almost 18% of the unemployed have a disability, and that very closely matches the figure for the board area at 17.9%. Now, so then visible minorities. So the visible minority figure is really low, and it always is low, and it's really a function of the fact that these are self-reporting designations. And we know when you take a look at the figure for the region, so among the unemployed in the central region, over 50% are visible minorities. And yet, if you look at the assistant client proportions, it's 18% in the region. And that's just not accurate, right? Because it's not accurate because in the GTA, no one knows what a visible minority is anymore. Because if more than half the people are people of color, then they don't, and all the staff are people of color. They're kind of thinking, why are we reporting this? Like we're all we're all in the same boat. So you see in Toronto, like the figures here just don't match the reality, and I think we're starting to even see that in the lower portions of Simcoe as you get into Innisfil and those areas, that the numbers aren't reflecting the client proportions. It may be it will in North Bay, and it may probably in Huntsville, but it doesn't. It's not reflected so much in the GTA numbers unless someone has some other interpretation on that. But I just don't think those figures reflect the actual profile of the clients. Stephanie?
Maybe they need to redefine what visible minority means.
It's redefining what visible minority means, and also whether if it's self-reported, then exactly. Yeah. That's the whole thing. Yeah, that's exactly it. Like Caucasian is a visible minority in Toronto. So then on the internationally trained professionals. So the international trained professionals are not only newcomers, but any person who acquired their professional or their post-secondary outside of Canada. And again, you see the real difference here. Like I put up all the numbers for the central region and how much Muskoka, and to some extent Durham, but especially Simcoe, Muskoka, are different from the rest of the central region. Because you look at a place like Peel Halton, 44% of their assisted clients are internationally trained professionals. That's a huge, compared to 5% for Simcoe Muskoka. Toronto and York also have high numbers. And in all those areas, it's been growing. It's growing at the central region. In the last 5 years, gone from 25%, from a quarter to a third of all clients. In Ontario, it's increased only because the figures in central region have increased. But in Simcoe Muskoka, it's stayed pretty well steady at 5 and 6% over the last 5 years. Assisted clients by educational attainment. Again, comparing the breakdowns to their share of the unemployed using census data. And there's actually a fairly strong match. If we just look at the board figures, so the board assisted clients, so 16% have no certificate. That's the one area, that's the largest gap. There are fewer people with no certificate seeking out assisted services than their share of the unemployed. So they make up 21% of the unemployed, they make up 16% of your clients. But everywhere else, it's pretty close. The apprenticeship figures are also far fewer apprenticeship people with an apprenticeship certificate who are seeking services compared to their share of the unemployed. But by and large, fairly similar. Again, I guess the other thing to note, you look at those figures on the unemployed side, that in the board area, around large numbers of people with a high school certificate or a college diploma compared to the central region, where you have many more people with a bachelor and even above bachelor, right? So 30% of the unemployed in the central region have a bachelor or higher university degree. Never mind, like almost half of them have a post-secondary degree. Actually, half, counting apprenticeships, half have a post-secondary. Same thing locally. Same thing in terms of the profile of the region's clients, but not so for Simcoe Muskoka. The larger proportion of your clients are 40% high school and another quarter who have a college diploma. So because we're doing the education piece, and because I was doing some work on another item, I wanted to just kind of bring this to your attention because this might be interesting just in terms of contextual point of view. So this is not Employment Ontario data, this is census data, and I wanted to compare the participation rate of males and females over the last almost 30 years. So basically I took 1990 and then 2017. And the colors are the different levels of education. And you'll see, so let's start with the red is university and the college is blue. So essentially the participation rate, so the number of people who are in the labor force, either employed or looking for work, the participation rate actually has hardly changed. It's only changed by maybe a percentage or two for males or females with a university or college diploma. You get to high school, people will only have a high school diploma, and you can already see that green line has dipped. And then those who don't have a high school diploma, have either some high school or no certificate, you can see how sharply the participation rate has dropped. Now, I'm also going to mention, I didn't put it up on the slide, these are 25 to 54-year-olds. So I've excluded youth who might have stayed in school longer, and I've excluded people who have reached, started to get into early retirement age. This is prime working age. So this is, I think this is one of the kind of stories that are really important to policymakers and service providers to be aware of. Because when we talk about participation rates, we tend to look at the whole population, and we've seen there's been a slow decline in the population rates, and people just think it's certain lifestyle choices or what have you, but it's extremely different depending on what population, what education level you have. And I'm just going to take one more minute to drive this point. we have put so much emphasis on getting people to get a post-secondary degree, right? You know, again, this is one of my refrains, is that Canada has the highest rates of post-secondary degree holders in the world. But actually, we haven't been able to produce as many jobs to accommodate all those graduates. And I suspect that, well, we know that a lot of graduates are working in jobs that don't require a post-secondary degree. And so they're pushing out those individuals who don't have a post-secondary degree who otherwise would have been suitable for that job. And, you know, and we know, and, you know, part of what Stephanie was mentioning as well was the higher premium that's being placed on soft skills also puts some of these people at a disadvantage, or some of the more digital literacy skills and so on. And so they're, not only are they unemployed, but they're just quitting. They're just dropping out of the labor force. And in fact, the difference in terms of the two genders, I'll add, is that women will more likely go into a job that's below their level of education. You know, partly because for other reasons, you know, perhaps they're going to do a part-time job while kids are growing and so on, and so they'll take a job in a retail or other service sector job. And the males who have that lower level of education, they tend to represent some of the blue-collar jobs, especially in the manufacturing, that we lost jobs in those categories, and they weren't able to transition to other jobs. So it again, for those people to come back into the labor force, there is even a far greater premium that has to be placed on the kind of literacy and basic skills support that's needed in order to allow them to be participants in the labor force again. Okay, next one, length of time that people have been unemployed who are assisted clients. And the main point is that assisted clients will tend to have been out of work a bit longer than the usual unemployed person. So at the extreme, almost a quarter of the clients at all levels who are assisted clients were unemployed for over 12 months. 23%, 25%, whatever, compared to that group only makes up 5% of all the unemployed. But again, as you know, like, people might want to see out their employment insurance if they've been lucky enough to qualify, or secondly, you know, they've only after a certain amount of disappointment do they finally decide, well, maybe I'm going to need some help to get assistance. That's not to say that you know, there are many people, almost half of your clients have only been unemployed for 3 months or less, 48%, but those half compared to all the unemployed, 2/3 of people who are unemployed have only been unemployed for less than 3 months. So that's where the difference shows up. So another just short contextual piece I'll give here is the trends in terms of the longer term unemployed. So this figure is measuring the percentage of the unemployed in Ontario who've been unemployed for 27 weeks or more. And the reason why I want to show this slide is because I think about the past. I'm stuck in the past. And what happened in the recession was really profound in 2008. You see the way that number, like before 2008, the level of the longer term unemployed was around 15% or lower. The recession hits and it shoots up to a point where 25% of the unemployed are unemployed for longer than 27 weeks. That's what causes people to drop out of the labor market, right? They start feeling the strain of just it's not working out. And that level of longer term unemployment has taken a long time to drop. And even now, in 2019, it has still not quite reached the level of where it was before the recession. Okay, so that's a pretty significant impact, because there's a lot of structural changes that took place once that recession hit. Employers just got a bit tighter in terms of finding other ways to address their labor needs. Okay, now the next slides are about income. So the profile, essentially around half of your clients ES assisted clients have no source of income. Again, hardly changed. Around 13%. You see your unemployment insurance, again, is pretty equivalent across the areas. OW, around 14-15%. ODSP, a smaller amount. Okay, and the differences over the years, so compared to last year, there's sometimes a difference of 2 or 3 percentage points, but it's been staying pretty, these proportions are pretty stable. And your client outcomes, so the large categories of employed, education, and so on, again, 71%, and essentially that's the target in a way you're expected to achieve. So everyone's hovering around that same amount, around 8% with unknown outcomes. We have these detailed ones. I think if you really held this up to your nose, you could make out these figures. Maybe you can see it on the slides here. But again, very little change, but most of the outcomes, the employed full-time, 46% at the board level, employed part-time, 16%. Those are the two big outcomes. Now, we get data on which industry the assisted client was laid off from, and if we have employment outcome data, which industry they were then employed after they received services. And what I wanted to show here, first of all, is what percentage of clients we have the data for. And this is important because we can't make determinations about where they're going or how they're performing if we don't get a good enough sample size. And essentially, in terms of the layoff data, that number increased early on, and now it's kind of it goes up and down, but we get layoff data for almost 2/3 of your clients in the board level, and otherwise in the rest of the region in Ontario we get it for around half. So here we get a higher proportion of data in terms of layoff data. And in terms of the outcome data, it's also better than at the region or Ontario level. We get outcome data, like what industry they ended up getting employed in, for around 1/3 of the clients. It's not a great number, but it's better than elsewhere. And it has been basically going up. So as someone who works with numbers, thank you. We can break it down according to the industry, and basically let me summarize this quickly. Essentially, so we have data, we know what industries they're laid off from, we know what industries they get employed in, and we can compare it to where everyone else is employed. So I guess the main story for Simcoe Muskoka is there are 5 industries that are key industries in terms of where people come from and where they get employed: construction, manufacturing, retail trade, administrative and support, and accommodation and food services. Let me just quickly do the math. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's probably around 70% of the clients come from those 5 industries. And in terms of their outcomes, actually more end up in those 5 industries. And it's at a higher rate than what the distribution is of other people who are employed. Okay, so what I'm saying is that your clients are more concentrated in these 5 industries, and where they end up is also more concentrated in those 5 industries. And I mean, where they end up may not be as surprising. I mean, you'll get a job in the kind of field you worked in before. Although I always have a bit of a problem with that administrative and support one. That one is always considerably higher. So like around 5% of people in Simcoe Muskoka work in administrative and support, whereas your clients, around 10% come from that area. So that includes industries like janitorial services, cleaning services, landscaping services, and temp agencies, I'm sorry to say. So I have to assume that there's a higher proportion of your clients who come from those, and also who may end up being employed in those categories. Now, the other thing is so in addition to industry, we get data for occupation. Now, there are many more occupational categories. So I try and do a particular kind of analysis here to show what the bigger story may be, and I say that with some caution. So what this chart, this is not Simcoe Muskoka, this is for Ontario, because I wanted to take the most numbers we have. And the first column is the distribution of jobs, of occupations that Ontario clients came from, categorized by level of education. Okay, so 16% of Ontario assisted clients had a university degree, came from a job that typically requires a university degree. 24% came from a job that typically requires a college or apprenticeship. 32% came from a job that typically requires a high school diploma, and 27% that required no certificate. And the next column is what their outcomes are after employment services. And I think that, the worrisome thing is that by this chart, 72% of them ended up in a job that required a high school diploma or less, which is even higher it's a higher proportion than the jobs they came from. Now, I think I wish we had better data, because we're not comparing always the same person. We might be we're counting people who are coming in, for example, who just finished school and they don't have any prior employment experience. So they don't show up on the first graph, but on the second graph, the first job they get may be, an entry-level job. And so that could distort the figures. It's a sort of thing also, I wouldn't put this in a report myself, because I don't want people to misinterpret what it means. But it would certainly help, as I say, to get a better set of data to know what those outcomes are. But I also think it does reflect to how much one can do in terms of the services that can be provided based on what you're expected to do because of what the funding is like and so on. So I really tend to think that what happens is that employers are more inclined to hire somebody based on what their previous job was, and they're not looking in terms of, okay, what are we going to do in terms of advancement? We're just trying to meet our current short-term needs, and that's about as much as we can do in terms of the placement services.